All right, good evening, everybody. Good to have you all with us this evening. I'm going to move closer to you because I doubt I'd get you closer to me. As Matt mentioned in the beginning there, we're going to be looking at Hezekiah tonight. And with each of the kings that we're looking at this week, there's a character trait that's the main focus of the lesson. For Hezekiah, the trait is loyalty. And so the focus is on Hezekiah's loyalty to God. And so as we work through this evening, we're going to spend some time thinking about Hezekiah as far as him exhibiting a faithfulness that most of the other kings of Israel and Judah don't. In many respects, of course, when we think of the kingdom of Israel, most of those kings, there's not anything good about them. There are a few that have some kind of good moments, some things that are somewhat possibly looking good, but in most cases, the trajectory of the kings of Israel is on evil. When it comes to the kingdom of Judah, there are far more kings there that reflect some positive traits. But there too, there's not a lot of those kings that are entirely good either. Hezekiah is one of those. There are a few others. Once you get past David, you have people like Asa, although at the end of his life, he kind of turns away from God. Jehoshaphat, Josiah, Joash, and that's pretty much it. So in general, the kings of Israel and Judah don't really reflect loyalty. In fact, more often than not, we see them turning to sin, turning away from God. But Hezekiah is one of those, one of those few that predominantly, and we'll look at a couple of situations tonight where he doesn't always live up to that standard, but predominantly Hezekiah's life exhibits loyalty to God. As we begin thinking about that, I want to start off by putting us in some historical context, so that as we think about when Hezekiah comes to reign, what's the nation like? And I think a lot of that we have to start with his father Ahaz. Ahaz was one of those evil kings of Judah. There's not much positive said about Ahaz. Ahaz was the son of Jotham. He was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned as king for 16 years. 2 Kings 16 verses 2 through 4 say this: Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even made his son pass through fire, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. What are some of the things that Ahaz, in this passage, that Ahaz did that are noted as being evil? All right, that's Ahab. Ahab was the one that killed Naboth. This is Ahaz. Yeah, Ahab was a king of Israel. Ahaz was a king of Judah. So again, 2 Kings chapter 16. He sacrificed his son. I mean, that one of the things that is prevalent throughout the religion of the area, the Canaanite religion, included child sacrifice. And that was one of the things that God had condemned them for. But here is one of the kings picking this up and practicing it. What else did he do? Not just child sacrifice. Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of like there's the child sacrifice, which is part of that detestable practices. But in general, he's doing all sorts of things, sacrificing children, other things. Right? He's living a life that is in rebellion to God's law, God's will. I mean, think about that from Hezekiah is his son. If the dad's like that, what do you expect the son to be like? I mean, most of the time, people in general, all things being equal, will follow the religious practices of their parents. Right? Not all the time. You may be one where, okay, I differ from what my parents believed, or you may know people like that. But generally, the human experience is children tend to follow the religious practices of parents. So this is the example that Ahaz is setting for Hezekiah. Right? All these detestable practices, right? He is involved in sacrifice to all these foreign deities, right? False gods. As we read through chapter 16 into chapter 17 as well, we see that Ahaz faced conflict with the nation of Israel, the northern tribes, Aram, Edom. Right? So he's facing all of these wars, battles, etc. Conflict. In the context of all this, right, he's facing all of these conflicts. We might expect, right, the story of Ahaz to be when he faces war, when he faces difficulties, turn back to God, right? I mean, for a lot of people, right, they face, struggles, difficulties, turn back to God. Ahaz doesn't. Instead, he turns to Assyria, the Assyrian Empire. So already he's involved in these detestable practices, and now he wants to get involved and make an alliance with an empire that is even worse. And so Ahaz makes an agreement with the king of Assyria, a man named Tiglath-Pileser, who is willing to help King Ahaz. After Assyria helps Ahaz out, Ahaz visits Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus. And there he sees an altar. And he's very impressed with that altar. So impressed, he sends blueprints of it back to Jerusalem so that they will replicate this altar. And in fact, Ahaz wants this altar to sit in the temple in the place of the altar of burnt offering. I mean, this is basically desecrating the temple, because you have an altar here to foreign gods. An altar that God did not command, did not want, and Ahaz sticks that altar there. Now, he doesn't destroy the altar of burnt offering. He puts it to the side. And basically says to the priest, we're going to sacrifice all the sacrifices on this new altar, but if I need to inquire by God, or of God, I'll do it with the old altar. I mean, there's a disconnect going on in Ahaz's mind, right? I'm going to worship all these foreign gods, but if I need insight, then I'll turn to God. which, in some ways that's a temptation we can fall into, right? I'm going to rely on all these things. I'm going to rely on my job. I'm going to rely on money. I'm going to rely on people. But if I'm in really, really bad situation, then I'll turn to God. There are some scholars who will say that when we see Israel and Judah involved in so much idolatry, what's going on is they've kind of created this idea in their mind of, if I need help with my crops, if I need help with the weather, if my wife isn't having kids, then I'm going to go to Baal. I'm going to go to Asherah. But if I really need help, then I'll go to Yahweh. Right? Then I'll go to the Lord. Right? But the Lord doesn't get involved in those little things. He only gets involved in those big things. Well, that's not the case. But I think we can kind of see how you can develop this mindset of, I'll only contact God when it's necessary. So this is the family life. This is the national life. This is the kingdom life that Hezekiah lives in. A father who is involved in all sorts of immoral, foreign God-worshiping practices. A father who has desecrated the temple, right? Made it unholy by bringing in an inappropriate altar. And a father who will only turn to God if he absolutely needs something. Could Hezekiah have been born in a more difficult position as far as thinking about, would he turn out to be a good king? Would he turn out to be a follower of God? I mean, it doesn't seem like the conditions are helpful for Hezekiah. Which leads me to ask, okay, well, why does he turn out to be such a good king, right? I mean, he's one of the few kings that are compared as favorably to David as Hezekiah. Josiah is another one. I mean, some of the other good kings are compared favorably with David, but not as strongly as Hezekiah. I mean, was it his mother? Was it the case like with Josiah where there were some priests or advisors who'd kind of taken Hezekiah aside and kind of reared him right? I mean, we don't know. But it seems likely there was somebody in Hezekiah's life, or maybe several somebodies who were in Hezekiah's life that were counteracting the impact that his father had. Now, it also appears that Hezekiah was a co-regent with Ahaz for a time, as you think about the Chronicles. But he became sole king somewhere around 715 BC. After the time shortly after the time the kingdom of Israel had fallen to Assyria. The name Hezekiah means the Lord strengthens. He was 25 when he began to rule. He ruled for 29 years. 2 Kings 18:3 says, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestor David had done. That's a pretty positive commendation that he's given, right? Just as David did what was right in God's eyes, so did Hezekiah. I want to kind of divide Hezekiah's life tonight in a couple of different sections. Well, we're going to talk about the reforms that Hezekiah undertook. We're going to talk about the siege of Jerusalem. The Assyrians kind of encircle Jerusalem. And then we're going to talk about Hezekiah's sickness that occurs around this time as well. So let's talk about Hezekiah's reforms. Right? As we mentioned, Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, had desecrated the temple, had practiced child sacrifice, all these kind of things. When Hezekiah becomes king, he works to change all of that. He works to overturn things that his father had done. He removes the high places. Right? These would have been places in some of the elevated regions around Jerusalem where some of these sacrifices would have taken place. Throughout the book of Kings and Chronicles, both books of Kings and Chronicles, there will be references to these high places. For example, we talked about Solomon last night, and Mike took us through the encounter Solomon has with God shortly after he becomes king. Where is he? He's at Gibeon. Gibeon is one of those high places. Right? So there were sacrifices offered at these high places, and so sometimes even some of the good kings, one of the things that's noted about them was, he did what his father David had done, but the high places were not removed. Right? People were still, they weren't just sacrificing at Jerusalem, they were going to these high places. And that's, as a sidelight, Psalm 121:1. Right? I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? Right? It's not saying, right, God's going to come from the hills. What it's saying is, right, it's the psalmist, he's looking at these high places. Right? I look up there. Does my help really come from there? No, my help doesn't really come from there. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Right? And so the mentality was, you have these sacrifices in these high places. But Hezekiah, one of his major reforms is to get rid of these high places. Right? Tear them down, desecrate them, keep the people from worshiping there. Right? So he's trying to get rid of idol worship, right, that his father had been involved in. Even to the point of destroying the bronze serpent. Let's look at this, 2 Kings 18. We'll start in verse 3. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestor David had done. He removed the high places, broke down the pillars, and cut down the sacred pole. These are other things connected with idol worship. He broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. What's this bronze serpent that's being talked about here? Yeah, so at one point, as punishment for the children of Israel, God sent serpents throughout the camp. And, of course, the people cry out for forgiveness, etc., deliverance. And so God tells Moses to create a serpent of brass, lift it up, and anybody that looked at it would be healed. Jesus, of course, in John chapter 3 makes a comparison, right? Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So the purpose of the serpent originally was to heal the people from the snake bites. After that time, what had happened? What did the Israelites do with it? They started worshiping it. I mean, I guess I can see how that kind of got started. I mean, you think, okay, I was healed by my snake bite by looking at this thing, and it might start off with, I'm not really worshiping it. I'm thinking about God by putting my focus on this, and then, a generation 2 down the road, it suddenly becomes, right, I'm worshiping this snake. So the people had even started worshiping this serpent, this brass serpent that Moses had made. This is the only other place that we really have any. There's no other indication between the time of Moses and the time of Hezekiah that this was going on. It was called Nehushtan. It's a little unclear what that's meant to represent. Scholars think that Nehushtan is some combination of brass and serpent, and so it could be translated something like the great serpent or the great brass or the great brass serpent. Right? It's basically a word that, says what it was. And it's also unclear, was this the name that the Israelites had given to it, right? We're worshiping the god Nehushtan, or is this simply what Hezekiah called it, right? We're going to destroy Nehushtan. And it's a little unclear, but they've made it an idol. And Hezekiah says, we're getting rid of it, we're destroying it. And as I mentioned, there's no indication before this point about this or after. We see more about Hezekiah's reforms in the book of 2 Chronicles. So if you turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 29. We can summarize the reforms that Hezekiah undertook by simply saying he undid everything Ahaz did. Right? If Ahaz did it, Hezekiah undid it. Right? He removes the altar, puts the altar of burnt offering back where it belongs. Right? Reinstates sacrifices being done on the altar of burnt offering instead of this altar that Ahaz had brought in. Additionally, he also sanctified the Levites. Let's look at, begin in verse 5 and read down to verse 11. He, that's Hezekiah, said to them, "Listen to me, Levites. Sanctify yourselves and sanctify the house of the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and carry out the filth from the holy place. For our ancestors have been unfaithful and have done what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him and have turned away their faces from the dwelling of the Lord and turned their backs. They also shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps and have not offered incense or made burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. Therefore the wrath of the Lord came upon Judah and Jerusalem, and he has made them an object of horror, of astonishment, and of hissing, as you see with your own eyes. Our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, do not now be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to minister to him, and to be his ministers and make offerings to him." Who were the Levites? What was their function? Right? They were in service to the temple. Now, some of the Levites were priests, if they were descendants of Aaron, but in general, most of the males from 20 to 50 were involved in some way with temple service. What seems to have happened with the Levites? They become unfaithful. What else? They weren't keeping up the temple. All right. So they have kind of abandoned their post, so to speak. And so now Hezekiah says, right, sanctify yourselves. What does the word sanctify mean? What's he asking them to do? All right, so the word sanctify is very similar to the word holiness. Right? Both of them have this idea of being set apart. Usually we connect it with morality, but it's not necessarily something moral. For example, an altar can be sanctified. Right? Well, the altar doesn't make any moral decisions. It's been set apart for the intent that God has for it. Well, probably with the Levites, there might be some of that moral component. Right? They've abandoned their post. they've probably fallen into, some idol practices as well, perhaps. And so Hezekiah is saying, the time is to give all that up. Sanctify yourself. Set yourselves apart. Right? Get back to what you were supposed to be doing. Get out everything in the temple. I mean, think about this. They had allowed or had participated in bringing all sorts of inappropriate things into the temple. It wasn't just this altar. Right? Chronicles gives us the idea of there's more than just this altar that Ahaz brought. There have been other things that have been done. And if you go to Ezekiel, you'll see that even in the temple, in some of Ezekiel's visions, people are worshiping false gods. In the temple. How could that happen? Well, I mean, if people are not remaining faithful to God, it's no wonder that things begin to accumulate. Falsehood becomes truth, so to speak, and they begin to practice inappropriate things. Beginning in verse 15, we can see the response that the Levites made, as well as the priests. They gathered their brothers, this verse 15 of 2 Chronicles 29. They gathered their brothers, sanctified themselves, and went in as the king commanded, by the words of the Lord, to cleanse the house of the Lord. The priests went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it, and they brought out all the unclean things that they had found in the temple of the Lord into the court of the house of the Lord. And the Levites took them and carried them out to the Wadi Kidron. They began to sanctify on the first day of the month, and on the 8th day of the month they came to the vestibule of the Lord. Then for 8 days they sanctified the house of the Lord, and on the 16th day of the first month they finished. Then they went inside to King Hezekiah and said, "We have cleansed all the house of the Lord, the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the table for the rows of bread and all its utensils. All the utensils that King Ahaz repudiated during his reign when he was faithless, we have made ready and sanctified. See, they are in front of the altar of the Lord." It took them 16 days to cleanse the temple. Right? We're not just talking about a few things in there, right? They had to go through and they had to get all of it out. But then once it was all out, there was ceremonial washing that had to take place of the utensils and the furniture, right? This was a significant process. But Hezekiah is leading them through this. We're going to get back to what we're supposed to be doing. The sad thing is, right, just in a few generations, his great-grandson Josiah is going to have to do it all over again. And so Hezekiah convinces the Levites, the priests, to engage in this. There was not enough priests to handle the work. They too, the Levites, apparently were quicker about sanctification. But 2 Chronicles 29, 35, and 36, "Thus the service of the house of the Lord was restored, and Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced because of what God had done for the people, for the thing had come about suddenly." All right, so Hezekiah looks to undo what Ahaz had done. Sanctifies the Levites. Cleanses the temple. The next reform that he brings about was the Passover. Now, what's the Passover? What? Right? It was a celebration of being, escaping Egypt, connected with the deliverance, the Exodus. How often were they supposed to observe it? Once a year. Well, evidently, here too, this Passover had fallen out of practice. Such a key moment, right, in the history of Israel. Released from slavery. God wanted them to do it every year to remind them of who they had been, where they had been, and what he had done for them, and they kind of gave up on it. And so Hezekiah brings about a restoration of the Passover. Now, they don't do it when they're supposed to do it. They were supposed to do it in the first month, but there weren't enough priests for all the ceremony, and so they had to do it in the second month. Chapter 30 of 2 Chronicles, beginning in verse 6. And this is what Hezekiah says. O people of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, so that he may turn again to the remnant of you who have escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your ancestors and your kindred who were faithless to the Lord the Lord God of their ancestors, so that he made them a desolation as you see. Do not now be stiff-necked as your ancestors were, but yield yourselves to the Lord and come to his sanctuary, which he sanctified forever, and serve the Lord your God, so that his fierce anger may turn away from you. For as you return to the Lord, your kindred and your children will find compassion with their captors and return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful and will not turn away his face from you if you return to him. Right? Hezekiah appeals to the people, and not just the people of Judah. Right? He sends messengers to the people that remain from the northern kingdom. Right? A lot of them had been carried off by the Assyrians, but there are still some in the land, and he's even appealing to them. Come now, come to the Passover. What's Hezekiah's hope? Or what hope does he give the people of Judah and the remnant of Israel if they will observe the Passover and these other things? What's the hope? I mean, think about this. You know, they have, as a nation, abandoned God. They've allowed the temple to be desecrated. There are people, including the king, sacrificing children, passing them through the fire to some false gods. They've stopped observing the Passover. But Hezekiah's promise is, if you will now turn back, it's not too late. If we turn back, God will be gracious. God will be merciful. God will even bring back the captives back to the land. I mean, God had punished the nation of Israel. In a few generations, he was going to punish the kingdom of Judah. But still the promise was, even now, if you will turn back. And so the people keep the Passover. The people are encouraged in such a way that there is this kind of great outpouring of repentance. In fact, Hezekiah calls for the people to consider making contributions to the Levites, to the priests, to support them so they could focus on the things that they were to do. And the people respond in a huge way. Hezekiah goes out and he sees all these big, huge piles. And what are these? Right? The people have just responded greatly. Right? They gave more than what was expected. 2 Chronicles 31, verse 20, beginning in verse 20, include this comment about Hezekiah. Hezekiah did this throughout all Judah. He did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. And every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God, and in accordance with the law and the commandments to seek his God, he did with his whole heart. He did with all his heart, and he prospered. Right? Here's a picture of a king, of a man who has seen what his nation had become, what his family had become, and he turned away from that, and with all his heart, he had turned back to God. Back in 2 Kings verses 5 and 7 of chapter 18, it says, "He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah after him or among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments the Lord commanded Moses. The Lord was with him. Wherever he went, he prospered." I mean, that's a picture of a man, a righteous person to be emulated, right? Somebody who is giving themselves fully to God, and God blessing them for that. That's one part of Hezekiah's life. Just because Hezekiah was good didn't mean that everything went well for him, that he never had any trouble. And that brings us to the second part, and that's looking at his relationship with the kingdom of Assyria. Due to Ahaz's actions, the alliance that he made with the kingdom of Assyria, Judah was probably expected to pay tribute. Right? Once a year, maybe a couple times a year, they were to send all sorts of money to the Assyrians. Well, Hezekiah decides to rebel against the Assyrians. I mean, that suggests some confidence. Right? I mean, Assyria was a pretty powerful empire. And Hezekiah says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. All right? And so he rebels against the Assyrians. And so the king, Sennacherib, comes through and takes various fortified cities, eventually surrounding Jerusalem. The archaeologists have discovered Sennacherib's camp in Lachish, which is one of these other places that he camps as he's doing this campaign. Recently, there have been some people who have claimed that they have discovered Sennacherib's camp for the Jerusalem campaign. So this is kind of really interesting here that basically we're talking 2 Kings 19 and the possibility of archaeological evidence of Sennacherib coming through here. There is archaeological evidence for some of the things that Hezekiah undertakes with trying to provide water for Jerusalem during the siege. There's a tunnel known as Hezekiah's Tunnel from this time. So there's archaeological evidence supporting this event. So Sennacherib is coming through Judah. He is conquering all these cities, some of which were rather well fortified, comes closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. As he gets towards Jerusalem, he sends some of his officials, and they go out through the city and are basically telling the people of Jerusalem what Sennacherib's getting ready to come do. All right, look what he's done to all these other cities. He's coming here. All right, he's going to do all these things here. And so they're kind of talking about, and what's even worse is Sennacherib's message is, none of these other gods have stopped me. Why do you think your God is going to stop me? 2 Kings chapter 18, beginning in verse 29. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you rely on the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then every one of you will eat from your own vine and your own fig tree, and drink water from your own cistern until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive oil and honey, that you may live and not die. Do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered its land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Eva? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of the countries have delivered their countries out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? I mean, Sennacherib's pretty boastful. Don't trust your king. Don't trust your God. I've conquered all of these places. I even conquered the kingdom to the north. Nobody has stopped me. Why do you think you're going to stop me? It's interesting. Sennacherib even says, how do you think God's going to help you? Because Hezekiah is the one that tore down all his altars, right? And so he's talking about Hezekiah tearing down all these high places. And like, well, Hezekiah says, come worship at this altar. He's destroyed all these other altars. Right? That should be enough evidence that God's not going to save you. Despite how successful Sennacherib has been, Hezekiah still has trust in God. In fact, he tells all the people, right, as this is coming through, this is 2 Chronicles 32, verses 6 through 8. He appointed combat commanders over the people and gathered them together to him in the square at the gate of the city, and spoke encouraging them, saying, be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him. For there is one greater with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. The people were encouraged by the words of King Hezekiah of Judah. Despite that, though, it does seem like Hezekiah is a little shaken up by Sennacherib's words. And so he appeals to Isaiah, the prophet. Right? Go to God on our behalf. Right? Surely God's heard all these things that Sennacherib has said. And it's true. None of the other gods have been able to stop him. Well, yeah, Hezekiah, because they don't exist. Right? They're not real. No wonder they haven't been able to stop him. But this is what we've seen, Hezekiah says, right? We've seen him go through and destroy all his people. 2 Kings chapter 19, which is also repeated in the book of Isaiah as well. Then Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent to Hezekiah, saying, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I have heard your prayer to me about King Sennacherib of Assyria. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. She despises you. She scorns you, virgin daughter Zion. She tosses her head behind your back, daughter Jerusalem. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, with my many chariots I've gone up the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I entered its farthest retreat, its densest forest. I dug wells and drank foreign waters. I dried up with the sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt. Have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should make fortified cities crash into heaps of ruins. while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded. But they have become like plants of the field, like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it's grown. But I know you're rising, and you're sitting. You're going out and coming in, and you're raging against me. Because you have raged against me, and your arrogance has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth. I will turn you back on the way by which you came. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city. Shoot an arrow there. Come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return. He shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. The end of all of this is Sennacherib leaves because he's heard a report of things going on back home, and 185,000 of his troops are destroyed in one night by an angel. Hezekiah's loyalty is rewarded. Despite, certainly he's afraid, he's got some fear, but he still trusts in God, and God is faithful to him. The last part, right? So the first part, Hezekiah's reforms, the siege of Jerusalem. Lastly, let's talk about his illness and its cleansing, or healing, I should say. And unfortunately here, we see some parts of Hezekiah's life that don't align with the rest of his life. It seems that various times Hezekiah struggled with pride. So while in many ways Hezekiah was loyal to God, there were a couple of places where he didn't live up to that. In 2 Chronicles, back to 2 Chronicles chapter 32, we see some of this pride in effect. And this is kind of the situation here where Hezekiah is sick, and he's healed of his sickness, and he expresses this pride. Let's go back a little bit here. The events in Kings and Chronicles may be told out of order, which it's not a contradiction, it's not a paradox. There are several places in Kings and Chronicles where it's not necessarily attempting to tell a chronological story as much as a thematic story, right? And so, the reason I say this is that the Babylonian king that is mentioned in this story may have actually finished his rule before Sennacherib's siege. Right? So chronologically, it looks like he was done ruling before Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, but it's told after. Right? But anyway, so Hezekiah gets sick. Isaiah tells him that he is going to die. And so he prays to God, "Remember now, O Lord, I implore you, I've walked before you in faithfulness with a whole heart and done what is good in your sight." Hezekiah then weeps bitterly. Isaiah is told by God, "Turn back and say to Hezekiah, Prince of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of your ancestor David, I've heard your prayer, I've seen your tears. Indeed, I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." So Hezekiah is healed of this illness, and he's told, I'm going to extend your life 15 years. What do you think Hezekiah's response should have been? Thank you. Right? Gratitude. Right? He's going to be grateful to God for that. And I'm sure that's part of it, but we also see now to 2 Chronicles chapter 32, that wasn't completely the case. Verse 25. But Hezekiah did not respond according to the benefit done to him, for his heart was proud. Right? So God had extended his life 15 years, and instead of being grateful, appreciating what God has done, instead, Hezekiah kind of gets arrogant, prideful. Kind of the exact opposite of what we expect Hezekiah to react. But he had this struggle with pride, evidently, a couple times during his life. He was human, right? We all sin. We all probably have something that we particularly struggle with. And for Hezekiah, it was pride. Now, in this case, again, 2 Chronicles 32, wrath came upon Hezekiah and upon Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. That sounds like it's a little bit more significant, right, than maybe what that one verse suggests. Right? The fact that God was bringing his wrath upon the people and Hezekiah because of this. But then there's also, shortly after that, the king of Babylon hears of Hezekiah's recovery. And so he sends envoys to him, and Hezekiah, again, pride, right? Shows him all of his treasures. And it shows him all of the wonderful things. Verse 27, Hezekiah had very great riches and honor. This is 2 Chronicles 32. Hezekiah had very great riches and honor, and he made for himself treasuries for silver, for gold, for precious stones, for spices, for shields, and for all kinds of costly objects. Storehouses also for the yield of grain, wine, and oil, and stalls for all kinds of cattle and sheepfolds. He likewise provided for himself cities, flocks, and herds in abundance, for God had given him very great possessions. So the envoys of the king of Babylon get to see all this, right? Hezekiah is showing all of these things, and Isaiah warns him that eventually everything he had was going to be taken to Babylon. Verse 31. So also in the matter of the envoys of the officials of Babylon who had been sent to him to inquire about the sign that had been done in the land, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. Right? This is a test. Right? Hezekiah, are you going to be prideful? Or are you going to say, look, what has God has done for me? No, evidently it was, look at all the great things I have. So Hezekiah still had some of those moments where, he fell victim to sin. Overall, though, the trajectory of Hezekiah's life is one of loyalty. Right? Just like David, he had moments where he did not live up to the expectations, where he fell into sin. But in many respects, what we see out of Hezekiah's life is one of loyalty and faithfulness. Now, we started by saying, look how terrible of an example Ahaz gave to Hezekiah. And despite all of that, something happened in Hezekiah's life that turned him to the Lord. The opposite happens for Hezekiah's son. 2 Kings chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. Manasseh, this is Hezekiah's son. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practices of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal, made a sacred pole, as King Ahab of Israel had done, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury, and dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And it goes more on to the prophets, and the prophets appeal to the people, but they did not listen. Manasseh misled them to do more evil than the nations had done that the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. What happened between Hezekiah and Manasseh? Somehow, Manasseh didn't follow the example of his father. Something turned him away. Now, maybe it was people after Hezekiah, right? Because Manasseh was only 12 years old when he starts reigning. So maybe it's people after Hezekiah's death. But he doesn't follow in the steps of Hezekiah. So what do we learn? Well, we learn about the importance of loyalty, faithfulness, the danger of pride, the power of God, and the deliverance that God had brought for the people. The need for reform, right? We always have to be looking at, right, are there things where we need to turn back to God? But then also, of course, the overarching narrative of both 2 Kings and to some extent 2 Chronicles is this decline. That you have these bright spots like Hezekiah, Josiah, but the general trajectory of Judah is on turning away from God. But we come back, I think, appropriately to the comments that we made earlier. Later in 2 Chronicles, after Manasseh has experienced his own captivity, he returns. He repents. We also see that with Hezekiah, right? His comments to the priests, the Levites, the people. If we will turn back, if we'll return to faithfulness, if we'll exhibit loyalty, God will bless us. Questions, comments, cries of disbelief. All right, if not, Harold, can I ask you to close us in a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we've had to come here and hear this lesson tonight. We pray, Father, that we'll learn from it, apply the good things to our lives here upon this earth. Father, we pray for this nation we live in, and we pray, Father, that we will turn back to you before it's everlastingly too late. Forgive us, Father, where we fail you. Help us to influence others to come to you always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I believe there are still some refreshments in the